welcome back to my channel. For those who don't know me, my name is Katharine, and in today's video, I'm going to be talking about my February reading wrap-up. I do apologize for the delay for this video. I try to post my reading wrap-ups of the previous month within like the first week of the month, and now it's well into March and I still haven't posted my February reading wrap-up, but here I am, better late than never. But my excuse was that I was in Florida, St. Augustine specifically, for a wedding at the end of February, beginning of March timeline. So that's the reason why I didn't have time to film a February reading wrap-up. But here I am. I just wanted to come on here and tell you about the books that I read in February. It was a pretty good month. I read 12 books, which is outrageous to say because on average I read about 5 books per month. And also February was like a short month. February is always a short month, and I'm surprised I did read 12 books. That's only because I listen to a lot of audiobooks. I've been taking advantage of Libby, which is like that library app, and listening to a lot of audiobooks when I'm like commuting to and from work. I also do DoorDash on the side, so when I'm, delivering food, I often listen to audiobooks while I'm doing that. So it was an overall really great month, and audiobooks were the key for really getting in all of those books. So let me just get into the books that I read because I know that's what you're expecting from this video, and I'm excited to talk about them. And I also will be talking about them in the order in which I read them, so let's just get into this. And if you see me looking down, I have my phone right here and I'm looking at Goodreads so I can remember what I read. But the first book that I did read was An Echo in the Darkness by Francine. It's the second book in the Mark of the Lion trilogy, and I loved this book. I gave it 5 stars, and that is because I feel really connected to the characters and the plot, and I oftentimes find myself like aspiring to walk my Christian faith out like the characters in this book, or this trilogy I should say. These books, I should say, and this trilogy, if I can speak correct English today. But essentially, it's a biblical fiction book, if I'm not mistaken, or a biblical fiction trilogy, I should say. And it's by Francine Rivers, and for those who don't know, Francine Rivers is like one of my favorite all-time authors. She's a Christian fiction author, but she doesn't just write biblical fiction. She writes a lot of just Christian fiction in general. She writes contemporary Christian fiction, historical Christian fiction, biblical fiction, and this specific trilogy, the Mark of the Lion trilogy, is considered biblical fiction. It doesn't really base any of the characters on like real life Bible characters, if that makes sense. It takes place during the time of the book of Acts, if that makes sense. And the Apostle John is mentioned like every so often throughout this series, but he's like not the main character. So don't expect reading this trilogy and like being able to see like actual Bible characters. So it's based during the time of the book of Acts in the Bible, but all of the characters are fictional, and I honestly really like that because I've often had problems with biblical fiction books that are based on actual real-life Bible characters, because with that sort of a situation, a lot of the authors have to take creative liberties to create scenarios or dialogue that is like a creative liberty, and like maybe they would have said that, or maybe they wouldn't have said that, or maybe they would have done something or wouldn't have done something. It's kind of just up to the author to take that creative liberty to make characters do certain things or say certain things. And when it's based on like actual actual people from the Bible, I kind of have a problem with that, because for me and like my conscience, I'm like, wait, did they actually say that, or did they actually do that, or wouldn't they have done that, or wouldn't have they have said that? So I'm glad Francine Rivers like created actual fictional characters, but it's still like based on truth of like what it would have been like during the Book of Acts. It spans across like Rome and Greece and Israel, this Mark of the Lion trilogy. I don't want to talk too much about An Echo in the Darkness, which is the second book in the trilogy that I read in February, because I don't want to give too many spoilers, but essentially each book in this trilogy follows a separate person that you meet in the first book, and basically like their faith journey. And of course, like I mentioned before, it takes place during the time of the Book of Acts. So it's like 1st, 2nd century Roman Empire in Israel, Greece, Rome, that sort of a thing. And there are like glimpses of romance in there, and like you see the Apostle John occasionally, but it's more about each character in each of the books' like faith journeys and how they come to Christ. And I really loved it personally. I loved the first book too, which was A Voice in the Wind, and An Echo in the Darkness was just as good. It definitely touched my heart, and there were moments in the book that I was highlighting and tabbing because I was like, I like how they handled that situation, or like I like how they said that to that person. It definitely made me admire these characters even though they were fictional, and make me want to be like them, like in my own life, in my own Christian walk. Okay, on to the next book, because I do have a lot of books to talk about. I then read Dragonfly and Amber, which is the second book in the Outlander series by Diana Gabaldon. I rated this 2 stars, unfortunately. I wanted to like this book so much because I did give Outlander, the first book in the Outlander series, 4 stars, but there were some issues that I had with the first book that really were exaggerated even further in the second book, Dragonfly and Amber, and that's why I gave it 2 stars, because the things that I didn't like in the first book were like just even more dramatic, if that makes sense, in the second book, and I just did not appreciate that. I want to like this book and this series so much because I really enjoyed the TV series. So I watched the TV series up through like season 6, and then once it finally clicked in my brain that it was a book series, I stopped watching the Outlander TV series and went back and started reading the book series, and I've been watching or rewatching the TV series as I'm reading the book. So each book actually lines up with each season. And so the first book, Outlander, lines up with season 1. The second book, Dragonfly and Amber, lines up with season 2, if that makes sense. And I've heard like the further you get into the book series and the TV series, the more they deviate from each other, and like the plots and things change, and like they're not as similar as they are at the beginning. So like I feel like season 1 and season 2 in the Outlander TV series is pretty close to the books, but like I've only heard that the TV series really like deviates from the books the further you get into the TV series. But anyways, I just didn't really like Dragonfly and Amber because of the fact, like I mentioned before, like the things that I did not like in the first book, Outlander by Diana Gabaldon, really were amplified in Dragonfly and Amber, the second book in the Outlander series by Diana Gabaldon. One of those things that really bothered me that were more amplified in the Dragonfly and Amber book is the fact that Diana Gabaldon puts way too much detail into her books. Don't get me wrong, I am a very big historical fiction fan. If I had to choose a favorite genre, it would be historical fiction. But Diana Gabaldon just like puts so much detail, and it's unnecessary. I love learning about history, I should say, if I can speak. I love learning about history when it's in the proper context. When you're putting things in books, make sure as an author, you're putting it in there because it's relevant to the plot and for character growth. Don't just put it in there to put it in there. Like, I'm not impressed when an author like just word vomits like information in politics and history as if it's like a history lesson just to prove the point that they know this certain history. Like, I honestly don't care that you know this much about this specific moment in history. Do you know what I mean? Just put the specific details in there that are necessary for the plot and for the characters, and let's move on. Do you know what I mean? Like, if I really wanted to learn about like a specific time period, I would watch a documentary or read a textbook. I wouldn't be reading like a historical fiction novel. Does that make sense? I hope you know where I'm coming from. Because, for example, Francine Rivers, who I just mentioned before, she's one of my favorite authors of all time. She's a Christian fiction author. She writes a variety of different genres within Christian fiction, but when she has written historical fiction, she has chunker books. Like, they're thick, okay? So she definitely, Francine Rivers, puts a lot of detail into her books. And she's a great example of someone who like does it right, where she puts a lot of detail in her books, but by the end of the book, it all makes sense. Like, you're like, oh, okay, that's why she was explaining that so much. With Diana Gabaldon, that's not the same situation. Like, I feel like, personally, Diana Gabaldon was just like I was mentioning before, like just word vomiting. Like, she was just like going on and on and on about these certain historical events or political things, and I'm just like, does this even pertain to what's going on? Like, I just felt like I was just like, it was too much for me. Like, I was getting overstimulated because my ADD and ADHD, I couldn't continue to care about what was going on because she was just like going and going and going. And then secondly, what really bothered me in the first book of Outlander by Diana Gabaldon, and that continued on into Dragonfly and Amber by her, is that the two main characters were just so unlikable. Specifically Claire. I can deal with Jamie. Like, Jamie is somewhat bearable because, first of all, Claire and Jamie are both super prideful, super stubborn, and honestly, sometimes very, very cocky and indignant and very full of themselves at points. But with at least Jamie, I can see some like redeeming qualities about him where he like sometimes admits that he's weak and he is humble in some aspects. Like, yes, can he be hot-headed and stubborn, and can he have a thick skull? Yes. But then there's like some soft moments with him where you're like, okay, like, I can tolerate you when you're being a dingbat, and also when you're being like this because you are being humble. Now in this situation, I can kind of tolerate when you're being a dingbat. But Claire is just like across the board, like very indignant. That's like the best word I can describe her as. She's just very unlikable. And there was a few moments where she like morally, like, I just didn't agree with what she was doing. Like, she's a very morally gray character. There were, I think, like a couple or a few situations where I was just like, why are you being so indifferent about this? For example, I don't want to give anything away, but like, Jamie goes through a very traumatic experience in the first book of Outlander. I'm not going to give too much detail, but like, has to do with like sexual assault. And basically, like, Jamie comes into contact with like this guy who had sexually assaulted him, and I feel like Claire kind of downplayed how Jamie was feeling. Like, she was like, why are you still like hooked up on this, and like, why are you still like worrying about him, and like, you don't have to be angry with him anymore. Like, why are you, being so upset in that sort of a situation? I just didn't like how she acted in that situation. Also, there were like a couple other situations where she was really indifferent upon, like, first of all, she was working as a nurse at this like hospital, and she like was acting very indifferent towards this person who didn't know whether or not she wanted to get an abortion, and Claire was just like, well, it's up to you, and I'm like, no, it's not up to you, that's literally murder. And then secondly, there was another talk that she had with someone else who was like contemplating suicide, and she was like, well, it's up to you. It was kind of like one of those situations again, and I'm just like, no, like, suicide is not the option ever. Like, don't ever encourage someone or like act indifferent towards someone who like is contemplating suicide. Like, literally get them the help that they need to be like, don't do that. I don't care like how like horrible their situation may seem, like mentally, like, encourage them not to commit suicide. But that's kind of like where I'm at. I'm gonna try to read the third book in the series called Voyager, but like I'm really hesitant on it. I'm gonna give this series one last final chance, like 3 strikes you're out. And then if I really don't like the third book in the series, like, I'm just gonna DNF the whole series. I also have been rewatching the TV series along with reading the books, and I am also just not liking the TV series as much as I had first enjoyed it, and I'm finding my enjoyment, or not enjoy, wait, what's the word? I guess, like, I'm not enjoying like the TV series for the same reasons I'm not enjoying the book series, if that makes sense. That's what I'm trying to say. But on to the third book that I finished Educated by Tara Westover, and I listened to this on an audio, like, on, what am I trying to say? In an audiobook format. And basically it's this real life memoir of this girl who grew up in a very like fundamentalist Mormon household in like Idaho, I believe. And she then goes off. She like was never able to go to school growing up, but then she ends up getting, like, throughout her life, goes off to college, actually somehow figures out how to get to college without having any sort of like education like growing up, and ends up getting like her PhD and stuff. This is like a memoir. It's a real life story. I did not rate this, but it's a very great listen. Like, I love listening to like nonfiction books because I feel like I'm listening to that person's life or their advice that they're giving. I definitely recommend listening to the audiobook or reading the book if you want, but I personally liked listening to it, so definitely check it out is what I'm trying to say. And then the next book that I read was The Housemaid's Secret by Frieda McFadden. It's the second book in the Housemaid series, and I gave this 4 stars. It's a thriller book about a housemaid, and I don't want to give too much away because like each book builds on itself, being that it is in a series. But just know that The Housemaid's Secret is like built off of the same girl that was in the first book, and basically she's like a housemaid to another family, and it's a thriller book. Like I mentioned before, I found it very addictive. Like, Frieda McFadden like writes very addictive books, if that makes sense. Like, her writing style is just very addictive. I don't know how many times I can say the word addictive, but just know that I was hooked to the book, and although it's not like the best literary piece that you'll ever read, it definitely was entertaining. And then I listened to The Fellowship of the Ring by J.R.R. Tolkien, which is the first book in the Middle Earth, or like not Middle Earth, but like the Lord of the Rings series. And I gave this actually 3 stars. I'm trying to read my rating or my review on Goodreads. So I was initially going to give it 2 stars, but I ended up giving it 3 stars because of the fact that I really enjoyed like being in Middle Earth and like the whole like environment and aesthetic, if you will, of like being in like this fantasy world. But I'm just realizing, I think, that I'm not a big fantasy reader. And I was really confused for most of the book. Like, I was getting it up, I was understanding it up to like the 40% mark, but then like after the 40% mark, I was just like, what the heck is even going on? Like, I actually had to like go on Spark Notes like after I finished reading it or listening to it on audiobook and like figure out what actually happened, because I just felt like J.R.R. Tolkien like kind of was jumping to here and there and everywhere, and they were going on this adventure and that adventure and over here with all these different types of like creatures and whatever, and I was just like, what's even happening right now? Like, can we just like condense this, please? Like, I also felt like I don't even know if this makes sense, but like I felt like there was like a lot going on while also like nothing going on at the same time. Do you know what I mean? I felt like they were going here, there, and everywhere with all these different creatures, but at the same time I'm like, what are they even accomplishing? Do you know what I mean? By the end of the book, I was just like, what did they even do? But everyone's pretty familiar with the Lord of the Rings series. Like, I feel like it's pretty widely known and popularized, so I don't feel like I need to tell you what the book is about. But just know that I gave it 3 stars when I initially was going to give it 2 stars. I was going to give it 2 stars because I was just like so confused with like 60% of the book. But I bumped it up to 3 stars because like I just like being in that world of like them like talking about food and describing like the landscape and stuff. But like that's the only reason why it's 3 stars instead of 2 stars. And then the next book that I read was The Holy Spirit by Billy Graham. I also listened to this. I gave it 4 stars just because of the fact that it did have a lot of like moments and sentiments that resonated with me. Like, I love Billy Graham. My dad actually got saved at one of Billy Graham's like crusades when my dad was like 18 or 19 years old. He went to like Boston University or Boston College to like this stadium, and my uncle brought my dad to it, and my dad actually you know, listened and, you know, responded to the altar call, and my dad walked up and like received Christ. So I do have like a pretty like big connection to Billy Graham, because like I feel like if my dad didn't, you know, get saved at one of Billy Graham's crusades, like I feel like my childhood would have looked a lot different. Like, I don't feel like my dad would have, you know, taught me so much about Jesus as he did. But I did like The Holy Spirit by Billy Graham. But like I said, it did have a lot of good sentiments in it and a lot of things that resonated with me and that I needed to be reminded of. But to the same point, there were a lot of things in there that like I've heard so many times before, like at church and stuff like that. So I gave it 4 stars. I definitely enjoyed it, but it was a little bit repetitive for me, like the certain things that were being said. And then the next book that I listened to was The Power of Positive Thinking by Norman Vincent Peale. My dad gifted me this book a while ago, like years ago, and I decided just to listen to it instead of actually physically reading it. And unfortunately, I gave it 2 stars. I'm sorry, Dad. But I just couldn't get past the fact that like Norman Vincent Peale like was like a pastor, and he wrote this book basically like as if to like convince Christians of like this like new agey like occult type practice that's been like trickling into the Christian church, actually, if you haven't realized. But like basically the whole book was basically him like telling us that like, even though he would mention like Bible verses and stuff, and like there are Bible verses that talk about like the power of the tongue and like the power of your thoughts and stuff like that, and like how we should always be like focusing our mind on glorifying Christ. But he was taking the Bible verses so out of context and in such a way where like he would often use words like energy or vibration and using affirmations, and like that's not what Christians should be practicing. Like all of those words that he was saying and like trying to describe, like that's not what that is. It's the Holy Spirit that you need to be asking to, you know, renew your mind and to help you speak positively over yourself. Like, you don't need all this like new agey type philosophies to, you know, speak over your life. You need the Holy Spirit. And also, like, I just feel like he was almost taking like the progressive, not progressive, but the prosperity gospel. That's what it is. I feel like he had like a lot of prosperity gospel sentiments in this book as well. Like, he was even saying like, well, if you're sick or if you're poor, like, you can, you know, restore your health or you can get rich. And it's like, no, like, it just says in the Bible that like in every circumstance, like, we can find contentment and joy in Christ. Like, whether you be poor or whether you be sick, like, just because you're gonna speak these affirmations over yourself doesn't make you like get rich or get healthy again. Like, sometimes bad things happen just because we live in a fallen world and like sin occurs, and like that's just how it is, and like we're not always going to be cured and we're not always going to like be rich. So I just gave that a 2-star, even though there were like some truths in the book. I overall just like didn't agree with a lot of the stuff that was in there. And then I actually read The Housemaid is Watching, which is the 3rd book in the Housemaid series by Frieda McFadden, and I also gave this 4 stars just because like I was kind of on a housemaid kick. As you could probably tell, I read 2 out of the 3 books in this series in February, and like I mentioned before, I can't tell you too much about the 3rd book because I would be giving spoilers, but just know that it's still following the same girl that was in the first Housemaid book, and it's, you know, essentially following the same sort of storyline where there's like a housemaid. In this book specifically, she's not the housemaid anymore. She interacts with the housemaid, but she's not the housemaid, which is kind of a cool switcheroo there. But like I mentioned before, Frieda McFadden's writing is like very addictive. It like really hooks you in, and I really can't wait to read more of Frieda McFadden's books. Like I mentioned, it's a thriller series and it's definitely thrilling. I apologize if the screen looks like it's been adjusted. That's because it has. My camera battery died and I had to change it. So here I am back again with my February reading wrap up. The next book that I actually listened to was Counting the Cost by Jill Duggar. She was one of the kids in 19 Kids and Counting, which is that TV series on TLC that I grew up watching, and I really loved this book. It gave me a lot of insight into the family because I did grow up watching the show. I did not give this a rating just because, like Educated, I just don't feel right like rating someone's life. So I did enjoy this book though. Like, it definitely opened my eyes to a lot of the things that the 19 Kids and Counting, like the Duggar family went through and is still going through, and like what like the harsh realities behind like the family actually was. And it also talks about like Bill Goddard, I think that's what his name is. He's like a leader of the like this like group, like this Christian foundational group that basically like teaches families about like how to raise a family. And this Bill, I think it's either Bill Gothard or Bill Goddard, I forget his name. I'll put his name and like his movement down below. But basically this like movement that this guy like created basically like teaches families how to, you know, live a Christian life, but like he doesn't have any kids or a family himself. He's like not even married either. So it was just like an interesting scenario that Jill Duggar like literally grew up in a family that followed this guy and like his mission. But anyway, it was a great book. It definitely opened my eyes, and I'm still really glad that Jill Duggar like still follows Jesus Christ even after having gone through a lot of traumatic experiences. And then the next book that I read was the volume 6 6 in the Remarried Empress manga series. I believe there's like 8 or 9 books so far in this series. I don't know if it's completely finished or not, but I really enjoyed this book. Of course, I can't tell you too much about this book because it's like really far into the manga series and I would be giving spoilers out if I said too much, but as the title assumes, it's about this empress who gets remarried, and it basically goes through her life like leading up to getting a divorce and then like getting remarried, and the whole series is just about that whole situation and how that even happened. But I really liked it. I gave it 4 stars because of the fact that I still enjoy the series and I still enjoyed the book, but there were just like a few like political things that were going on that just like didn't make sense to me, and that's the only reason why I bumped it from 5 stars to 4 stars. The next book that I read was The Pilgrim's Promise by John Bunyan. I think that's how you pronounce his last name, and a lot of people know what The Pilgrim's Progress is, but if you don't know what it is, it's basically this book that was written in like the 1600s by this guy who was like an evangelist. Like I think he was a pastor maybe too. I honestly don't remember, but basically this book is like a very like fundamental book in like the Christian community, and if I'm not mistaken, like it's the second most widely read book next to the Bible. But I listened to The Pilgrim's Progress, but I just gave it 3 stars because even though like I do understand the allegorical nature of the book, the old English for me was throwing me off, and also like a lot of what they were talking about in The Pilgrim's Progress, like I felt like I already knew like just from reading the Bible. So basically The Pilgrim's Progress is essentially just about this guy who leaves his family and goes on this like pilgrim's like adventure. I don't even know how to describe it, but basically it's an allegorical story of like the Christian life and the Christian walk, and like, you know, it talks about like walking through the valley of death and like how you're going to come upon the pearly gates and all that, and all of it really is just like a big allegory and big like messaging of like what the Christian life looks like. But I enjoyed it. Like it was okay. I would love to like actually physically read it one day. Like I know there are editions of this book that are in like modern English, so maybe I can understand it better. But I did give it 3 stars. It was okay. Like I did understand for the most part what it was about, but from what I did understand, like I already knew all that kind of stuff. Like I feel like The Pilgrim's Progress is a great book to read if like you first become a Christian. But since I've been a Christian for like quite some time, like it was kind of already stuff I knew what the Christian walk is like. Not that like I know it all, or that like I'm not trying to be like prideful in any way, but like a lot of the things that they were talking about were things that I have just read in the Bible, and that, you know, Jesus warns us about like the struggles of being a Christian. And then the last and final book that I read, or I should say listened to, was Just Mercy by Bryan Stevenson. And basically I gave this 4 stars. It was very educational. Again, it's another like true life like sort of story. The reason why I rated this one rather than not rating the other ones that are based on true stories is because this one actually had like more of like factual like educational aspects to it too. It wasn't just like objectionally like someone's actual story that they're telling you. So this guy, Bryan Stevenson, it's like about him being a lawyer for people on death row, and they were basically either wrongly accused or they were given sentences that were like way too severe for what the actual crime was. So Bryan would like basically like try to advocate for these individuals that are on death row to either get off death row and serve a lesser sentence, or basically just get out of prison in general because they were either wrongly accused or they were like basically imprisoned for like crimes that they should have served a lesser punishment, if that makes sense. And for your information, this is about like people who are in the colored population, so like people who are African American and everything. So it really focuses on that sort of population in our American history. And I don't think he's a lawyer anymore, but it basically just looks back on his life basically defending colored people on death row who were either wrongly accused of crimes or were given punishments far too severe for what the crimes actually were. And a lot of these crimes were actually committed by like children, and a lot of the time like they were very severely punished they were like basically served punishments as like adults rather than, you know, as children. And so that kind of plays an aspect to this as well. But I found it really interesting and it was very educational. I gave it 4 stars like I mentioned before. But those are all the books that I read in February. Again, I read 12 books in total. A lot of them I did listen on audio because of the fact that I just really don't have a bunch of time anymore. I'm trying to save up money by doing DoorDash, so that's why I have been listening to a lot of books while I'm commuting to and from work during my full-time job, and also listening to it when I'm doing DoorDash. But anyway, let me know what you read in February. Let me know if you read any of the books that I read in February and if you liked them, or if any of the books that I read this month are some books that you want to put on your to-be-read list or your TBR. But anyways, do all the YouTube things that you know how to do, like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!